He stormed the beaches of Normandy in a tank. He conquered the world's toughest endurance races without flinching. He helped build a machine that humiliated Ferrari on its own turf. And then, just 2 months after the biggest injustice of his life, he died alone on a California racetrack, behind the wheel of a car that had already taken another life, while testing it for the very company that denied him his greatest triumph. The movie Ford v Ferrari finally brought Ken Miles into the spotlight, and Christian Bale delivered a performance that's hard to forget. Without that film, his name might still be buried deep within racing history, known only to the most devoted fans. But even that powerful story only scratched the surface, because the real Ken Miles wasn't just a brilliant driver. He was layered, misunderstood, and carrying a story far heavier than what made it to the screen. His life was filled with quiet battles, overlooked brilliance, and a legacy that deserved more than the ending he got. Stick with me, because by the time we're done, you'll see why the man Carroll Shelby once called his greatest test driver wasn't just a racing legend. He was a story the world never fully told and never truly finished. The movie Ford v Ferrari makes Ken Miles look like a short-tempered mechanic with a failing garage, someone only Carroll Shelby believed in. It's a strong introduction, but it doesn't tell the full story. Yes, some parts are true. Ken Miles was born in Sutton Coldfield, near Birmingham. He left school early and trained at Wolseley Motors. But long before he ever touched the GT40, there was much more to him than the film shows. Before racing fame, Miles served in the military, not just as a driver, but as a skilled instructor in the Territorial Army. On October 1st, 1942, he became one of the first members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, or REME, a highly respected unit responsible for keeping British military vehicles running under extreme conditions. Later, he was assigned to the Guards Armored Division and then the 29th Armored Brigade. He arrived in Normandy just days after D-Day and finished the war as a staff sergeant and tank commander. That's a big deal. This wasn't someone sitting safely behind the lines. He was leading tanks through dangerous combat zones. That kind of experience shapes a person. Miles wasn't just driving machines. He was responsible for keeping them alive in life or death situations. He had to understand every part, every weakness, and react instantly when something failed at high speed. That's where his real genius came from. So when Miles later warned Ford that the GT40 had serious problems, he wasn't guessing. He had already spent years working under pressure where mistakes could cost lives. He knew exactly what he was talking about. But the film doesn't show this side of him. Instead, it focuses on his rough edges, his accent, his temper, the dramatic outbursts. It makes for great entertainment, but it misses the deeper truth. Even the version of Ken Miles played by Christian Bale, as impressive as it is, leans heavily into this idea of him being aggressive and hard to control. In the movie, he's always clashing with Ford executives, throwing tools, even fighting with Carroll Shelby. In reality, people who knew Ken Miles described someone very different. On the track, he was known for being calm, respectful, and precise. Some even called him the Sterling Moss of the West Coast because of how clean and controlled his driving was. He pushed cars to their limits without losing control or causing unnecessary risks. Carroll Shelby himself once said Miles was the best test driver he had ever worked with. Not just fast, but helpful, patient, and willing to teach others. He compared him to Juan Manuel Fangio in that way. Miles didn't see himself as a racing superstar either. He once said, "I am a mechanic. That has been my life's work. Driving is just a hobby, like golf is to other people." That tells you everything. This wasn't a man chasing fame or drama. He was focused, thoughtful, and deeply skilled. Someone who understood machines on a level very few ever could. The film added extra anger and conflict to make the story more exciting, which is understandable. But in doing so, it left out something important: Miles' quiet discipline and sharp mind. And then there's the part of the story that truly stands out. In 1966, Miles won Daytona and Sebring, two of the toughest endurance races in the world. He was on track to make history at Le Mans, aiming to become the first driver ever to win them all three in a single year. But that moment never came. Ford ordered a staged photo finish at Le Mans, and because of how the rules worked, Miles was denied the win. Just like that, history slipped through his fingers. And here's the incredible part. Decades later, no one has ever done it. Not Mario Andretti, not Fernando Alonso, not any driver since. That rare triple crown of endurance racing in 1 year still hasn't been achieved, and Ken Miles remains the only person who ever came that close. Charlie Agapew, one of the Carroll Shelby crew mechanics, didn't sugarcoat it when he spoke about what really happened. According to him, Ford Motor Company wasn't focused on one driver making history. They wanted a headline that simply said Ford had won 24 hours of Le Mans. If Ken Miles had taken the victory outright, he would have achieved something no one else ever had, winning Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans in the same year. The movie Ford vs. Ferrari shows the dramatic photo finish, but it doesn't fully capture what was truly lost in that moment. This wasn't just another win slipping away, it was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement, something so rare it still hasn't been repeated, like a record that was never officially written into history. In the film, Carroll Shelby seems hesitant when he tells Miles to hold formation, and Miles appears calm as he accepts it. That part is partly true, but the real moment carried far more emotion. Shelby mechanic John Collins later remembered hearing Miles snap loudly after the final pit stop, making it clear he understood exactly what he was giving up. That reaction reveals the real man behind the helmet, not cold or detached, but deeply frustrated, holding it together only because he was a professional. Even within the team, there was tension. Team manager Carroll Smith quietly reassured Miles that winning wouldn't cost him his job, hinting at the pressure surrounding the decision. Still, Miles chose to follow orders, even though it meant sacrificing his place in history. And after that race, he never publicly complained about it again. Years later, Shelby himself admitted something that changed how people saw the whole story. He confessed that the decision wasn't forced on him, it was a choice he made in the moment. When Leo Beebe suggested having all three cars cross the line together, Shelby agreed, thinking it would be a powerful image for Ford. What he didn't realize was how the race officials would interpret that finish. And that's where the real tragedy sits, not in one villain or one bad decision, but in a simple conversation between two men who believed they were doing the right thing. In the end, one of the greatest drivers of his era paid the price. Just 2 months later, on August 17, 1966, everything took a darker turn at Riverside International Raceway in California. The film shows Miles dying in a fire, but the real story is more complicated and in many ways more disturbing. He was testing the experimental Ford J car, a machine designed to replace the GT40. It had a radical shape and new lightweight construction, but it hadn't been proven fast enough at high speeds. What's often left out is that this car program already carried a deadly history. Earlier that same year, Walt Hanskin, a highly respected driver, lost his life during testing connected to the Le Mans program after a crash in the rain. Because of that earlier tragedy, development of the car was paused. Engineers stepped back, trying to understand what went wrong, but months later, testing resumed, with Miles behind the wheel. On the day of the accident, everything seemed normal at first. Miles completed several laps without issues. Then, on one of the final runs, something went terribly wrong. At high speed, the car suddenly became unstable, spun off the track, and flipped violently. The impact threw Miles from the car, and he died from his injuries before help could reach him. The wreckage caught fire afterward, destroying critical evidence and making it almost impossible to determine the exact cause. To make matters even heartbreaking, his teenage son was there that day and witnessed the aftermath. In the years since, experts have looked back at the design and found likely answers. The car's aerodynamics created dangerous lift at high speeds, especially at the rear, making it unstable. After the crash, those flaws were corrected, but for Miles, that realization came too late. Years after that era, engineers at Porsche and other car makers ran into the same issue. Cars with a long, low shape and a camback-style rear didn't always stay planted. At very high speeds, they could actually start to act like airplane wings. Let that sink in for a second. The rear design on the J car, the part Ford Motor Company engineers were most proud of, was supposed to make the car faster. Instead, at certain speeds, it was lifting the car off the ground from underneath, just like a plane preparing for takeoff. Now imagine that happening at over 200 miles per hour, going downhill in the hot desert air of California. In that moment, the car wasn't gripping the road anymore, it was fighting it, and eventually the road lost. When the crash happened, Carroll Shelby could barely explain it. He admitted they didn't fully understand what went wrong. To him, it felt like the car simply came apart. What hit even harder was the loss behind it. He said they had no one who could replace Ken Miles, no one who could match him. Miles wasn't just a driver, he was the foundation of everything they were building. In Shelby's words, there will never be another like him. Even experts agreed this wasn't driver error. James T. Crow wrote shortly after the crash that anyone who had seen Miles drive knew this wasn't his mistake. The truth is simple but painful. Ken Miles didn't fail that day. The car failed him. But here's the part most people don't know, and it changes everything. After the second fatal accident in just 5 months, Ford executives were under intense pressure, so they made a critical decision. Future cars would include a strong steel roll cage, similar to what was used in NASCAR at the time. The redesigned version of the J car became the Ford Mark IV, and that one change made history. In 1967, during the 24 Hours of Le Mans, Mario Andretti was involved in a massive crash. It could have ended his life, but it didn't. He walked away. That roll cage, the one introduced because of Miles's death, protected him. From that point on, steel roll cages became standard in racing. That single safety improvement has saved countless lives over the years, including Andretti's. So when you look back at it, the truth is hard to ignore. Ken Miles lost his life because a car wasn't fully understood at extreme speeds, but because of that loss, the cars that came after were safer. The very machine that won Le Mans in 1967, the Ford Mark IV, was built on lessons learned from his death. In a way, Miles helped win that race, even though he wasn't there to see it. The movie Ford vs. Ferrari shows Shelby and Miles as fiery partners who pushed each other to the limit. That part is real, but it barely scratches the surface of what Shelby truly felt. After Miles died, Shelby didn't just lose a teammate, he lost something much deeper. His company, Shelby American, stepped away from the mall racing for good after 1967. Think about that. A team that just conquered the biggest endurance race in the world never came back. For a man like Shelby, who thrived on competition and always chased the next win, that decision says everything. He had fought through failures, money problems, and pressure from powerful executives. But this one was different. This one stayed with him. The film ends with a touching moment between Shelby and Ken's son. It didn't really happen, but emotionally it feels true. What the film doesn't show is the weight Shelby carried for the rest of his life. He lived with the knowledge that one small decision at Le Mans cost his closest friend a historic victory, and not long after, his life. Ken Miles is finally honored years later when he was inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2001. That's 35 years after his death. 3.5 decades. For all that time, the man who helped build Ford's Le Mans dominance, the man who won Daytona, conquered Sebring, and should have stood at the top in Le Mans, was remembered mostly by those who were there. But his impact never faded. It lives on in every safer race car, every protected driver, and every lesson the sport refused to ignore. It wasn't until the 2019 film Ford vs. Ferrari that his name finally reached everyday audiences. But even that film only scratched the surface. It softened the edges of his life, gave him a gentler ending than reality allowed, and compressed a story that was far deeper, messier, and more human than any 2.5-hour film could truly capture. Not long after his passing, his wife, Molly Miles, shared a heartfelt message with Road and Track in November 1966. She wrote that nothing could replace what she had lost, but the outpouring of love around her had been overwhelming. She reflected on their life in California as one filled with ups and downs, sometimes chaotic, sometimes difficult, but always, at its core, happy. That doesn't sound like the life of a tortured, single-minded racing addict. It sounds like a man who found meaning, not just in speed and machines, but in the people around him and the life he built. And then, in a cruel twist, it was all taken away. A car that shouldn't have been on track that day. A crash where the evidence was lost before the full truth could ever be uncovered. But here's the question that lingers long after everything else fades. What if things had gone differently? If Ford Motor Company hadn't staged that controversial photo finish? If Ken Miles had been allowed to claim the Le Mans victory he rightfully earned? If he had spent those final months as the first man ever to win the Endurance Triple Crown in a single year? Would he still have gone behind the wheel of that J car? There's no answer to that, but it's a question that stays with you. Because in the end, he didn't die in the spotlight. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory during a race. There was no cheering crowd, no grand stage, no moment that neatly fit the legend of a racing driver. He died on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the California desert, doing what he had always done, testing, refining, improving. It was quiet, dangerous, and largely unrecognized work. The kind of work that made cars like the GT40 and Cobra what they were. The kind of work that made everything he touched better. He didn't die a hero's death. He died doing his job. And in many ways, that truth carries more weight than any cinematic ending ever could. Even Shelby himself understood just how irreplaceable he was. He once said there was no one who could take his place, that Miles wasn't just a part of the team. He was the standard, the backbone, the reference point for everything they built. Shelby wasn't exaggerating. Yes, Ford went on to win Le Mans in the years that followed, but they never found another Miles. No one did. Because he wasn't just a driver. He was a rare blend of instinct, intelligence, and humility, shaped by a life and experiences that simply can't be recreated. He left behind a family that loved him, a son who witnessed his final moments far too young, and a legacy written not just in trophies, but in the machines he helped perfect. Records were set, history was made, and still, decades passed before his name truly meant something to the wider world, thanks in part to Christian Bale bringing his story to life on screen. It took far too long, but at least now, people are finally paying attention. And maybe that's the real takeaway here, because the deeper you look beyond what Hollywood shows you, the more powerful the truth becomes. Stories like this aren't just about racing. They're about people, about choices, about what gets remembered and what almost didn't. And once you see that, you start to realize the real story is always worth chasing.